So this is the introduction to the phylum Annelida. Annelids, as you can see on the screen, are sometimes familiar to us, in this case on the bottom right of a leech, but perhaps you've never seen the animal in the upper left. The animal in the upper left is called a fireworm. It's a common name, of course, and these are in the ocean, and they're frequently on coral reefs, and they are predators. And in fact, they are a major pest for anybody who's keeping a marine aquarium. And so what people often do in keeping a marine aquarium is they buy what's called live rock, which is rock that's taken from a coral system, perhaps. If it's wild collected, that's not all that good. It actually probably damages the coral reef if they do that. Or it can be from another culture, an indoor kind of a cultured tank. And on those kind of wild rocks, if you think about it that way, people bring those rocks into their system, and it's really tough to not also introduce some of these fireworms. And they start out really, really small, maybe a quarter of an inch or half an inch. But then I've collected them actually in the Florida Keys, in which they're over 5 inches long. Really, really long. Certainly longer than anybody's fingers. And I don't think fingers are close to 5 inches. I'm going to measure my finger right now. One of my fingers is a little over 3 inches, but I think it was close to 5 inches, the one we got in Florida. Again, we used Ziploc bags, so we didn't want to handle it. And there's a reason I didn't want to handle this guy, because these little white tufts here are actually little hollow spines or tubes, and they have a toxin in them, and that toxin burns real bad. So it's a heck of a defense for these guys, and it's also a heck of a reason not to handle them. Well, whether or not it's a fireworm in the upper left or a leech in the bottom right, what you can see is that these guys have these creases at regular intervals all along their length. And that is true segmentation. And so these are called segmented worms. And segmentation is the repetition of a body unit, and it's many, many systems of the body. It's a repetition of the body unit over and over and over along the length of the animal. So it's kind of like a train. If it was a train full of grain cars, so it's the train hauling probably corn if it's Illinois, and there might be 100 cars all together, and so each car is doing about the same thing, and that's the point. Now, on segmented worms, the segments do not all do the same thing, but from an external appearance like this, it looks like, well, at least along the middle of the body, they seem to be doing about the same thing, and just as well on a leech. I want to remind you about the giant chart that we have. Here you can see highlighted the part of the chart that we should now have filled out by now. So when we've looked at body symmetry here, I hope you have that we didn't have any true symmetry. In Cnidarians, we had radial symmetry. We had bilateral symmetry in platyhelminths, and this will be bilateral symmetry as well here. On tissue layers, we had no true tissues in sponges. When we looked at the embryo of Cnidarians, there were 2 true tissue layers, and one of them that we find on platyhelminths is not found in Cnidarians, and I leave that up to you to figure out which tissue layer is found in platyhelminths but not Cnidarians, and doesn't that sound like a multiple choice question that you can expect? Well, platyhelminths, like annelids, have those 3 tissue layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. They have both the same. The big difference is over here in the coelom column. Platyhelminths have all 3 layers but no coelom. Annelids have all 3 layers, but they have a coelom. Now let's talk about the mouth anus. This should be one, there is no mouth or anus in the case of sponges, and this should be one mouth anus opening in the case of Cnidarians, and also in the case of platyhelminths. Now, of course, tapeworms didn't even have one opening. Tapeworms didn't have an opening at all to a digestive tract. So we have a digestive tract, a gastrovascular cavity in Cnidarians and platyhelminths, but only one opening. So, by analogy, these are kind of like a vase or a cup that you might be drinking a hot beverage today, that cup has a single opening. It's not a pass-through system. Annelids do. They are the first time we are seeing a true anus separate from the mouth. And that means that we can have flow through. It means we can have one-way flow through. And if you've ever worked any place where you're trying to address a lot of something, so it could be washing dishes, and which is an assembly line. It could be that you were working in a place providing food, maybe at a food bank, for example. You might be sorting or packaging things, or you might be at a soup kitchen in which people are moving through, or you simply have gone to our dining hall and you know there's a place where you'll get meat, and there's a place where you'll get vegetables, and a place you get salad. And in some cases, people move carefully in a one-way process through such a system. And that's more efficient if you move just one way through. And we'll talk about additional consequences of a one-way digestive tract also in lecture. So segmentation for the first time here. These others did not have segmentation. And a coelom is not present except for annelids. So annelids are very important. First time we see a coelom, first time we see segmentation, first time we see a true anus. So these three columns are really, really big here. These are all protostomes, and we haven't talked about what the difference is between a protostome and a deuterostome. We're going to see that these are all protostomes up till this point. The echinoderms and chordates are the deuterostomes. Otherwise, mollusks, arthropods, and everything in the blue box are protostomes. As it says at the very top, this information, as we keep adding on an animal phylum here, is cumulative. So you need to know how the latest phylum compares to what we saw before. Okay? Information for all prior labs will be quizzed as we proceed through these. So I might say to you, what is it that an annelid has that a platyhelminth does not? And the answer is three different things. An annelid has an anus, platyhelminths did not. It has a coelom, platyhelminths did not. And it is truly segmented, platyhelminths were not. So we've just talked about these kinds of characteristics, and we'll go through now a little faster. Here we're looking at an earthworm, which is also one of the annelids. The main annelids for us are earthworms and also fireworms here, and leeches. And all of these are bilaterally symmetrical. Not sure that you know that even in the case of an earthworm, this muscular band called a clitellum, which is making mucus for their reproduction, it does not go all the way around. It's closer to kind of a C-shaped bracelet that might be on your arm, where it's got an opening on one side. So it's not a complete ring, it's more C-shaped here. So there's clearly a belly side to earthworms and a top side, and that's characteristic also of other bilaterally symmetrical organisms like a lobster right here. These are the three tissue layers we looked at. So here is ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm by color pattern. Ectoderm blue, mesoderm red, endoderm yellow. Over here is the annelid situation in which the coelom is a hollowed out mesoderm. So in the coelom right here, which is that white space, there's mesoderm on either side. We aren't spending a lot of time on nematodes. We don't have a lab dedicated to nematodes. Nematodes are pseudocoelomates, and their coelom is in between the endoderm layer and the mesoderm. Here, a true coelom is within the mesoderm. It's a hollowed out area within the mesoderm. That's a true coelom. Okay. We said mouth separate from the anus. And so the answer here is that in an earthworm, food enters the mouth, passes through the body, and exits at the other end. Same thing for you and I. But not so in planarians and cnidarians. In those groups, food entered and exit through the same opening. It's another way to think about that in cnidarians and platyhelminths is that food enters and exits kind of like when you park. So if you're parking on Blackburn's campus, you probably pull into a space, and then you back out. In some cases, like at Walmart, I like to park at places where when I park farther away, get back in my car, I just pull forward. But in this case, I'm talking about a parking space with one of those bumper guards, so you pull in and pull back out. And that's kind of like cnidarian and platyhelminth digestive systems. So what else are we going to see affected by a one-way digestive tract? And the answer is we're going to have all sorts of systems like digestive glands, of course, but the circulatory system is also going to be affected. And the circulatory system is going to be delivering blood that's going to be absorbing some of the nutrients from the food and transporting it around the body. There's another system called the lymphatic system, and that's also going to be specialized with the digestive tract. The advantages of a one-way flow through digestive tract are simply this: specialization along the length. So if we think about your own digestive tract, you take food in your mouth, you swallow it, and it makes its way to the stomach. And that's largely your stomach as a holding place. It doesn't do that much digestion. It holds the meal and then slowly releases that meal to your small intestine. That allows the digestive tract then to have this specialized compartment. In the case of an earthworm, they have specialized compartments. We're going to see a crop and a gizzard. And you know of a crop and a gizzard in birds. A crop takes in the food ingested. It functions a lot like a stomach. The gizzard is very muscular and churns and processes that food, okay, before it goes through the intestines. The point is, you can have a crop specialized in function, followed by a gizzard, followed by an intestine, if you have a one-way digestive tract, because those are step-by-step processes. That's what's permitted. Here you're looking at a diagram. This is also a piece of art. It's a figure from your textbook. And here you can see the repetition of body units. So here we have these blood vessels running along the length, connecting the top and the bottom parts. It's kind of like a ladder, but this is on both sides. And this repetition of body units is true segmentation. So we have other systems of the body. This is the lumen of the digestive tract. That's circ system. This is nervous system. This is a system getting rid of extra fluid, regulating the amount of fluid. This is a diagram, I think, on your to-know sheet. It shows you lots of details about the internal anatomy. I'm going to come back to this diagram in just a minute. But this is an earthworm cutting cross-section. This is clearly the ventral side, and this is clearly the dorsal side. And see if you can see anything in this diagram that suggests why this is the ventral side. So if this earthworm is crawling around on the top of soil, this is the part in contact with the soil, and this is the part exposed on the top of the worm. Do you see anything that's an adaptation for the contact with the soil? And it's right here. The adaptation is CT, right here. These little spikes are like having spikes on your shoes, or any kind of good sole to your shoe with any kind of rough ridge. They're for grip. And these little CT allow the earthworm to grip its environment. Notice you don't have them on the top. If you've ever grabbed an earthworm and tried to pull it out of a hole, I hope you did so gently, because you can pull the worm in half. But the grip that an earthworm has with the hole, in part, is due to these little CT grabbing the soil. So here's a real slide. You're going to have a look at something like this in lab. And the question right now is, where's the coelom? So this is still dorsal side up, ventral side here. And in this particular sectioning plane, we didn't catch any of the CT. Actually, I have a little bit of structures associated with the CT right here. Maybe a little bit of the CT right there. Maybe there's one. Well, this is the digestive tract. And this is the thick musculature around the body. And this is the space that's the coelom right here. The answer to the question. This is the coelomic space all around here. This is a blood vessel. This is a cross-section of a nerve. And there's a small blood vessel. If you look at a live earthworm, so we're going to have, I hope, some for you to see that are out crawling around. I'm going to try to buy some at Walmart if I can get them. And if you looked and tried to see an earthworm cut in section like this, actually with all this temperature, I'm worried about getting the worms for you. But anyway, if you looked at an earthworm and just put it down on a surface with this dorsal side up, you actually could see through the body wall and see this dark line, and that is this big blood vessel on the dorsal side of the body. So this is now an interpretation of that diagram, and the diagram you have on your to-know sheet also labels things. And of course, you can find these kinds of diagrams very easily on the internet, okay? So what we see again, big dorsal blood vessel, solid nerve cord down here, a little blood vessel here. This area and this area are very thick muscles, okay? So here it shows an outer circular muscle layer and an inner longitudinal muscle layer. When this circular muscle layer contracts, it squeezes and narrows the worm. So it's like over-tightening your belt, okay? This would be like over-tightening your belt. The longitudinal muscles, when they contract, they make the earthworm shorter. Circular makes them thinner where it's contracted. Longitudinal makes the worm shorter. Okay? So these are opposing directions on the muscle groups and helps the worm to move. We're going to talk more about that. Here's now the digestive tract lining. These are the cells lining the digestive tract. And you notice this looping peninsula right here, this extension. And it's called a typhlossole or a typhlossole right here. See if you can think about why worms that had this had an advantage over worms that didn't. So what is gained in worms that have this extension versus those that don't? And this is sometimes true when people build ponds. The answer is you have more shoreline. You have more surface area of the lining of the digestive tract. And what is occurring at that surface area? And the answer is absorption of the nutrients. So here, this is an adaptation, the typhlossole, to increase the surface area for absorption of the nutrients that they've digested. Here's up close in another slide in which the very, very outside of the earthworm is called the cuticle. And then just underneath it is the hypodermis, so that's a big, thicker area of the skin. And below that is the circular muscle layer, and this is the longitudinal muscle layer. Another way to think about this is to think about wood. So sometimes you cut the wood with the grain, or sometimes you cut it across the grain. Okay. So here we're cutting it sort of with the grain, and this is a cross section of the worm, so we cut it with the direction of the musculature. Here's some of the classification is on the screen, so you can review this. These are the sedentaria. And this is a great big giant medicinal leech. Now in past years, we've ordered leeches and we've had them available, live leeches for people to see. And the kind of leeches that we would have in Illinois are much smaller than what's shown here, and they're flatter than what's shown here. And you should know along Macoupin County Creek, which flows right through here, I have collected leeches before. Or in the floodwaters in the spring when the area stretches then away from the banks or accumulates in low areas, I've found leeches under logs where the area is going to be flooded. This kind of leech, a medicinal leech, is actually used in medicine. And why might we use it? Well, what leeches are good at, and this is the business end, the thin end right here, they have little cutting kinds of teeth. They can cut through our skin, and we normally don't feel it because they have another chemical released that's an anesthetic. So you don't feel it. They also have another chemical that's an anticoagulant. So they can cut through your skin and you don't feel it. and the blood doesn't clot right there. Well, why might we ever need these in modern medicine? Well, we can look at this person's hand and imagine a horrible accident where the person's tip of their pinky finger got cut off, some kind of horrible cutting accident. And now in medicine, we reattach that finger, so there's going to be a lot of stitches here, and we want to pull blood into that fingertip. So we could put this leech right here on the fingertip, and you wouldn't feel it. Of course, this is already a real painful thing. And it would pull the blood into that reattached tip of the finger. It would pull the blood into that reattached tip of the finger. Okay, because it would have an anticoagulant that would help to keep that blood flowing, and it would be drawing blood from the hand into the fingertip. So it could be the tip of an ear, it could be the tip of a finger, or any other application that's like that. Here's more of what we'll see in our freshwater situations. And more here. Here are people using leeches, perhaps for other reasons. There's a feeling somehow that when people are sick, they should remove blood. There is not good evidence of that. It is incredibly rare that you would want to have blood removed. There is something that occurs where people have too much iron in their blood, and they wind up needing to reduce the amount of blood because of that. But boy, guys, I just don't think putting a leech on you is any good medical practice unless it's a surgical situation. Now, another kind of worm, and this is an altogether different kind of body plan, are worms that are in the ocean, and these are all marine. So if we say marine, it means ocean. These are marine worms. They could be, guys, they could be a few inches long, or they could be a foot or a meter long, which is really long. And what these worms do is they make a tube. So this is a tube that they've secreted. And this is the head end of the worm. And these are filter feeders. So this one has been spread out kind of like a feather. And it's filtering the water. So these tube worms are filtering the water. Here you can see the body of the tube worm. And then here's the tube that it secreted. And then there's the plume. We tend to find these kinds of tube worms near hydrothermal vents, which is that volcanic area in the ocean bottom where we have a very special ecosystem that is not based on the sun. Yeah, chemical energy, chemosynthesis that's going on in the bottom of this ocean. And this isn't the only kind of animal that lives there, also clams and other things. So these are tube worms. And here, in a fancier way, these are sometimes called feather duster worms. They can be quite small. And if you see people that have a marine tank, or if you make your way to Shed Aquarium or someplace like that, they're likely to have these kinds of tube worms. They're very, very common, and you can see, goodness, it just looks very much like a feather. So they're filter feeders. Again, marine worms that are filter feeders. This is what the body looks like when you take it out of the tube. So you're just seeing this part outside the tube. And there's one of the tubes running right here, fanning out. And at this point, I hope you've kind of enjoyed looking at some of the animals that we've been studying in the lab. And I hope that you go to the internet and do some Google image searches, and also onto YouTube, where you can see these kind of worms on display. So if you put in YouTube tube worms, they'll probably show you pictures of these. And one of the things tube worms do is that they're extended like this filter feeding, but as soon as they're disturbed at all, they pull into the tube, just right back in. And then it has to be a period of time before they come back out, kind of like a turtle pulling its head inside the shell. Now, another version of tube worms are short little guys, and this is one worm that has a branched head end. And no surprise, these are called Christmas tree worms. They're called Christmas tree worms because they look like Christmas trees, but they're always found in pairs. They're different colors, and you'll always notice that one color is paired unless there's been damage, right? So here's a pair of yellow and a pair of blue ones. An orange one. And here now again, pairs of blue ones, and then other colors that are around there. This one's probably got a pair on the other side over here. Now, also in these images, you can see this plate thing right here. And think of this as kind of a manhole cover. When these worms are disturbed, they quickly pull in, but if a fish was trying to eat them, the fish could just pick at the hole. So when they pull in, this pulls in over them as a plate that protects them in their hole. Again, like closing a hatch or pulling a manhole cover over you when you go down into a sewer. I don't know that you guys have done that a lot. I haven't. So here's another spectacular one. Of course, this is a single worm, and there's its little plate. The plate's called an operculum. I don't think you need to know that. And more Christmas tree worms right here. And you can see how beautifully branched these filaments are and very effective at filter feeding. A very, who would think about leeches and earthworms being in a phylum that's beautiful? But these marine forms are just gorgeous. Here's the fireworm out there, also beautiful, even though it's a predator. Here's more of these versions of marine worms that are like fireworms. You can see some of the variations. These are called Erantia. Sometimes you might see the word polychaete worms. The one that we're going to see in lab is called Nereis, Nereis. Oh, well, there you go. There's the Nereis. And we're going to see a preserved one, so it's going to be really dark, and it isn't going to look this beautiful coloration that you see right here. Here's the head end, and you see actually eye spots. These are little palps that are feeding, and they're finding something to eat. On this particular Nereis, here sticking out are jaws, and you'll be able to see them if you poke around and look at the Nereis we're going to have available for you on the head end of the body. Now, this area right here, the pharyngeal region, might come up and surround some of these teeth, the teeth retracted. So you might have to kind of poke into a hole to find these jaws, the Nereis jaws. I've never seen them alive, by the way. So, on an earthworm, and by the way, we're going to have a model that's going to look kind of like this. It's a great big model, and it's named after Pop Jewell. It wasn't Dr. Jewell. He didn't have his PhD. But Jewell, who was a biology professor, and I believe Jewell Hall was named after him. People called him Pop Jewell. He built models of animals and other kinds of life and then sold them all across the nation. And then eventually sold his company and made a good amount of money. And when I came to Blackburn, they said, have you seen these models before? And I went, yeah, they're found all over. Yep, schools have these. And they said, yeah, but the guy who made them is from Blackburn. Wow. So one of Pop Jewell's original models will be part of the station for you to see in lab. And what you'll see as you look at the model, and then if you look at an earthworm, is that where the mouth is located, there's a little flap above it called the prostomium. Now, stome, as in stomata, means mouth. So in a leaf, a stomium is a place where we have gases exchanged on a leaf. Here, it's a place where, of course, we're taking in the case of earthworms, probably soil. And they have this prostomium, which is a single upper flap. Right here you can see above the mouth opening. And then the first true segment of the body that goes all the way around is the peristomium. Word root peri means around. And so this is the first true segment that is forming the opening of the mouth. So there's the peristomium right here, and there's the mouth opening. Okay. I don't know what's going on in this diagram because this right now is not whatever's white right here. These white arrows are not properly pointing to anything. So here we're taking a look at an earthworm. A few basics about this. I told you the clitellum does not go all the way around. And the clitellum is more closely associated with the head end of the worm. So here's clitellum here, and you can see clearly that end of the worm is shorter than the back end of the worm. Okay. And we're done. So there's a lot to be done, and it'll be a busy lab for you when you come in at most of the stations. You'll be looking at earthworm anatomy. I think I'll have a demonstration dissection for you to find things, but you'll want to look. Maybe use a dissection scope as well. You're going to look at the detailed anatomy of Nereus and look a little bit at the anatomy of a leech, but we're not going to open those up. And also you'll have sections of earthworms to look at. So I'll see you in lab on Tuesday.